The laughter of her friends echoed in the chilly night air as Sally hugged them one by one, feeling the warmth of their bodies against her own. Their evening had been filled with delectable food and drinks that slid down her throat like liquid gold. Her tummy was full, she was a little tipsy, and suddenly exhausted. "Are you sure you don't want us to call you a cab?" Tina asked with furrowed brows, her breath visible as she spoke from the porch. "No, I'll be fine," Sally reassured her, a confident smile plastered to her face. "It's not even 20 minutes on the subway, and they've got security walking around." In reality, Sally didn't feel as confident as she sounded, but she didn't want to trouble her friends any further, nor could she afford the expense of a cab. "All right, if you say so," Tina replied hesitantly, still not entirely convinced. "Just call me when you get home, okay? I'm staying up until I hear from you." "Will do," Sally promised, offering a final wave before turning towards the direction of the train station. The shadows cast by the towering buildings loomed over her as she navigated the maze of empty streets. Sally would never get used to the way one could find themselves in another world entirely, just a stop or two away from home. She quickened her pace as the icy wind howled through the concrete canyons, the only sound at all aside from her heels taking turns against the pavement. Rounding a corner, Sally caught sight of the familiar entrance to the subway station. Grimacing, she descended the steps into the bowels of the underground. As she reached into her bag for the train pass, she found herself talking aloud. "Just a few stops," she told herself. "I'll just wait by security until the train arrives." The flickering fluorescent lights cast distorted shadows across the platform, and as she got closer, Sally's heart sank. The security office, her only source of comfort, was empty and dark before her. Where are they? Sally wondered, her heart pounding in her ears. She glanced around, anxious to appear calm and cool in case any strange eyes were following her. Yet, she saw nothing but the vacant benches and glowing ticket machines and clusters of trash and papers decorating the ground. She scanned her pass and went through the gates, which elicited a two-tone sound of acknowledgement that echoed through the empty station. As she reached the escalators, she found that they had been turned off, so she hurried down the stairs 2 at a time, reaching the empty platform in seconds and glancing around once again for any sign of the security officer. But there was no one. Nothing. Even the screens which displayed train arrival times were blank. Maybe Tina was right, Sally admitted silently, regretting her quick dismissal when her friend expressed concern. She glanced at her watch, counting the seconds as they ticked by, each one stretching on for an eternity. A sudden gust of wind swept through the station, creating a blizzard of loose debris and nearly snatching Sally's spirit from her body entirely. Then her terror gave way to relief, which in turn morphed into disappointment as she realized the arriving train was headed in the opposite direction. Sally hugged herself, trying in vain to shake off the chill that seemed to emanate from within. As she waited, her eyes darted around nervously, searching for the approaching train as the other continued on its way, with no sign of anyone in its green windows at all. She hadn't even noticed an operator in the front car. In the distance, she caught a glimpse of movement, and after allowing her eyes to focus on the faraway shadows, she spotted a figure at the other end of the platform. The dark, hulking shape swayed side to side as it moved forward slowly, and for a moment, Sally considered that the shadows themselves had come to life before her. The figure grew nearer and nearer, slowly shuffling and swaying along, and still with no discernible features. Sally's breath caught in her throat as she considered heading back upstairs for security, but she didn't want a chance missing the train. She clenched her fists tightly as beads of sweat formed on her brow. With a quick glance, she confirmed that the shadow was getting closer and closer. Then, a distant rumble tickled Sally's ears, and she eagerly looked into the tunnel at the headlights speeding toward her like a shooting star. Looking back, she saw the mysterious figure was only a few hundred feet away and was coming directly for her. "Come on, come on, come on," she said, watching the gleaming silver cars grow closer and closer. Suddenly, the dark figure was directly beside her, and she screamed, hurling herself into the nearest train car just as the doors slid open with a deafening hiss.
"You got $1?"
A raspy voice asked from behind her. Startled, Sally whirled back around to find herself face to face with a disheveled woman, buried inside of a massive, tattered coat, with its large hood pulled over her matted hair in protection.
"Sorry, dear. Didn't mean to scare you."
With shaking hands, she fumbled through her bag for a few singles. Yeah," she stammered, trying to force a polite laugh that presented more as a choking grunt. "Don't worry about it. I'm just a little jumpy, I guess."
"Thank you, dear."
The woman took Sally's offering gratefully and shared a sweet smile in return.
"You get home safe now."
With another hiss, the door between them closed, and the train jolted back into movement. Sally sighed in relief as the exterior became a blur of flickering lights and reflections and shadows, and settled into a seat nearby. Like the station, the car was empty, as were the ones in front of and behind her from what she could see. She may have been the only passenger on the entire train. Just 4 stops, she thought, counting down in her head as the train rattled along the tracks. I'll be in bed before I know it. The screech of the train pulling into the next station split the air, drowning out the rhythm of its wheels on the tracks. The doors slid open to admit a trio of young men in messy suits, their laughter and slurred speech announcing their arrival before they even staggered into view. They lurched through the doors, arms wrapped around each other for support, practically carrying the man in the middle, who could barely stand. "Look at this guy," one of them hooted, his words thick with drunken mirth. He seemed to be missing his necktie. "Can't handle his liquor." "Easy, man," said the other one doing the lifting. Though he still wore a tie, this fellow had accessorized his dress shirt with a few dark stains, and the pant of his right leg was tucked into his sock. The man in the middle sat limp as his eyes rolled wildly in their sockets, then locked onto Sally with a sudden intensity that made her blood run cold. Panic clawed at her, but she refused to let it take hold. Instead, she pulled a novel from her bag, burying her face between its pages in an effort to escape his gaze. "Don't let us bother you, miss," No Necktie said with a sheepish grin. "He's just had a bit too much." Sally tried to focus on the words in front of her, but found herself unable to make sense of the jumble of letters, her eyes scanning over the same line over and over, comprehending nothing. "Shouldn't have let him drink so much," the other muttered, shaking his head. "But I guess that's how we learn, right?" Sally risked a glance up from her book, relieved to find the man in the middle had nestled his head onto the shoulder of the man beside him. He had passed out, and though she was still thoroughly uncomfortable, Sally couldn't help but find it humorous to see a trio of grown men practically cuddling together in public. The subway train came to a stop at the next station, and the man in the stained shirt gently lifted his friend's flaccid head towards the other. "Sorry, buddy, this is me. You good to take care of him?" "Of course," No Necktie responded, grinning again with a flashing glance in Sally's direction. "See you later." As the car jolted into movement once again, the book slipped from Sally's grasp, landing on the floor directly in front of the pair. She quickly stood and plucked it up from the floor, wiping away the mysterious fuzz that now stuck to its cover. "Sorry, excuse me," she mumbled, shifting back to her spot. Though she was tempted to find another seat further away, she didn't want to draw any extra attention from the men. "You ever drink too much?" the conscious man asked Sally. She had no desire to respond, but couldn't risk escalation. "Don't underestimate the anger of a man ignored," Tina often reminded her. "No, not really," she said meekly. "I don't mean to be rude, but I'm really close to finishing my book." The man's smile widened. "Come on, that ain't true. Pretty girl on the train this time of night had to be getting into some trouble." Sally held her breath, staring at the page before her as she tried to recall which stop they were at without looking up. She couldn't wait to bail for the safety of her apartment. Whatever," the man said. "He'll be just fine, just needs to sleep it off." Yeah, Sally stammered, forcing a tight-lipped smile. "I get it." He paused, and she knew he was watching her as she kept her eyes on the book in front of her. Then he continued, in a lower voice. "You know, you'll never finish that book there if you don't turn the page." Sally laughed nervously. "I'm not great at multitasking," she said. The sharp cry of the train slowing into the next station interrupted them, and No Necktie gently shifted his friend's weight so that he now leaned against the wall. "Well, this is me," he said, standing and approaching the door. "Don't worry about him, miss, and get those pretty legs of yours home. Nothing good happens this time of night." As the doors slid shut behind the departing drunk, Sally found herself alone with the unconscious man, silently slumped against the window as the train continued towards its next destination, Sally's stop. Though she was glad to see the others go, she was appalled at these so-called friends for leaving the man like this. He was practically dead weight, and they abandoned him on the plastic bench like a forgotten glove. Sally wondered if she could get the operator's attention when she left the train, or if there might be security patrolling on the next platform. Suddenly, she felt responsible for this utterly creepy stranger, and imagined reading in the news the next day about a man robbed or worse after falling asleep drunk on the subway. She had almost placed her book back inside of her bag when she was hit by a sudden wave of terror. What if this man wasn't unconscious at all, and simply waited for his chance to follow her off the train? She didn't want to indicate that she was preparing to leave, and quickly considered ways she could shake him off if he followed, whether he was stumbling drunk or stone-cold sober. But her apartment was only 2 blocks from the station, and there was little she could do besides bursting into a sprint if the man indeed began to stalk her. At long last, the train began its gentle arc around the curve nearing the platform, and Sally planned to erupt from her seat and through the doors at the last possible second. The train seemed to be taking the curve quite swiftly, but she didn't mind. Anything to get home sooner. With the turn complete, the subway pulled into the station and came to an extremely sudden stop. Then, in one horrible moment, 3 things happened simultaneously. First, the doors of the train opened with a hiss, welcoming a heavy wave of stale, freezing air from the platform. Second, Sally pulled herself up from her seat, stepping towards the door as swiftly as she could. And third, the unconscious man slipped from the bench, face-planting directly in Sally's path with a sickening thud, and causing her to trip, tumbling into the open doorway and dropping her book to the tracks below. Sally looked at the stranger on the floor in front of her and shrieked with utter terror. The back of his head was crusted with blood, surrounding a fresh bullet hole in the center of his skull. Moments before, Sally had locked eyes with a corpse and conversed with his killers. The man in the middle had been dead the whole time. On a crisp autumn evening, a young couple named Emily and Mark were driving through the dense woods of northern Michigan. They were on their way to visit his mother, who lived in a quaint, secluded town known for its charm and scenic beauty. Typically, they would have arrived in time for supper, but a series of delays and a late start had caused them to fall behind schedule. As the sun dipped down below the horizon, and darkness began to blanket the landscape, they decided it was best to find a place to stay for the night and continue the journey in the morning. As they navigated the winding road, the headlights of their car flickered across a small, dilapidated house nestled deep in the woods. It looked as though it had been forgotten by time itself, overgrown with vines and shrouded in shadows. Emily squinted through the windshield, her curiosity piqued. "Maybe they can rent us a room," she suggested, her voice tinged with hopeful optimism. Mark hesitated, but eventually agreed that it was worth checking out. They pulled up the gravel driveway, the crunching of stones under the tires the only sound breaking the eerie silence of the forest. The house, though modest, seemed warm and inviting, with a soft glow emanating from the windows. Mark knocked on the door, and after a few moments, it creaked open to reveal an elderly couple. The man was tall and wiry, with a thick white beard that nearly reached his chest. His eyes were sharp and bright, and he greeted them with a smile that seemed both kind and weary. His wife was a small, delicate woman with silver hair pulled into a tight bun. She had a gentle demeanor and welcomed them with a warm hug. "We don't rent rooms," she said kindly, "but we're happy to have you stay as our guests. We have plenty of space, and we'd enjoy the company." Grateful for their hospitality, Emily and Mark accepted the offer. The old woman quickly set about preparing a pot of coffee and slicing a rich, homemade cake. They all gathered in the cozy living room, where the scents of freshly brewed coffee mingled with the sweet aromas of the cake. The walls were lined with old photographs and strange artifacts. The elderly couple regaled them with stories of the house and the surrounding woods, tales that seemed to blend fact and folklore in a manner that left the young couple feeling uneasy but intrigued. After an hour or so of conversation, the elderly man led Emily and Mark to their room. It was quaint and surprisingly modern, with a neatly made bed and a large window that overlooked the dense forest. They again offered to pay for their stay, but the old man insisted. "No need for that. We're just happy to have you here." The young couple went to bed, the creaking of the old house and the occasional rustle of leaves outside their window their only lullabies. They rose early the next morning, careful not to disturb their hosts. On a table near the front door, they left an envelope with a generous sum of money, hoping to express their gratitude. Then they quietly made their way back to the car and set off towards the next town. Emily and Mark enjoyed a hearty breakfast at a small diner, where they recounted their overnight stay to the restaurant owner, a burly man with a thick mustache and a kind smile. The owner's face turned ashen as he listened. "That can't be," he said in disbelief. "That house burned down 2 years ago. The couple who lived there perished in the fire." Emily and Mark exchanged stunned glances, their hearts racing. They were certain of what they had seen and experienced, so they decided to return to the house, hoping to clear up the confusion. As they approached the familiar gravel driveway, their hearts sank. The house was no longer there. In its place was a charred skeleton of what once was, a burned-out shell that lay silently amid the encroaching forest. Emily and Mark got out of the car, their footsteps crunching on the gravel as they approached the ruins. The sight of the devastation was almost too much to bear. Mark noticed something unusual amid the debris and pointed it out to Emily. Among the scattered remnants of the house, a charred table lay partially burned under the ash and rubble. Emily's breath caught in her throat as she recognized the shape of the table. It was the very one they had seen by the front door. Mark knelt beside it and with trembling hands began to sift through the debris. A low, mournful cry escaped Emily as she saw what lay on the table. The envelope they had left behind the previous night was unmistakably there, partially scorched but still intact. Mark gingerly picked it up, his fingers trembling as he opened it. The money inside was still crisp and untouched by the flames. As they stood there, stunned and speechless, the air seemed to grow colder, and a faint whispering sound rustled through the trees, as though the forest itself was lamenting. Unable to comprehend what had happened, Emily and Mark stumbled back to their car and drove away in silence. The image of the burned-out house and the envelope now burned into their memories. Their once mundane journey had become an encounter with the inexplicable, a night spent in a place where time and reality blurred, and a reminder that sometimes the boundary between the living and the dead is not as solid as it seems. The house had vanished, the fire had claimed it, but the memory of that eerie night lingered. In a quaint little town where everyone knew each other's business, the news of a formal dance at the old Grand Hotel spread like wildfire. The excitement was palpable, and it seemed that no one could talk of anything else. Among those eagerly awaiting the event was a young man named Thomas. Handsome and kind-hearted, Thomas had his eye on a young woman from his school named Clara. Clara was sweet and gentle, but her family was not well off. Despite her modest means, Thomas thought she would be the perfect companion for the dance. And so one afternoon, he presented her with a bouquet of fresh wildflowers, which he'd picked and arranged especially for her. She was overjoyed by the gesture, and even more so to accept his invitation to the dance. As she walked home, Clara basked in the fluorescence of her bouquet, her chest filled with warmth as she inhaled deeply, and the gentle breeze carried her name through the flowers. She'd never felt so special, so eager for what was to come. But as Thomas saved up for a new suit and made reservations at a charming restaurant, Clara had no idea what she was going to wear. She didn't have any money, especially not for an outfit she'd only wear on one occasion, nor did she have any sisters or any friends of a similar size. Clara was fretting about it for days, and her excitement was overtaken by anxiety as the evening of the dance approached. "Maybe you can rent a dress," her mother suggested gently one morning. Clara's face brightened at the idea. Though she was skeptical about finding something elegant enough, she decided to take her mother's advice. There was a pawn shop not far from their home filled with forgotten curiosities, and Clara made her way there, her heart pounding with both hope and trepidation. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of old leather and dust. The shopkeeper, a gruff man with a bushy mustache, eyed her intensely as she browsed through the racks of clothing and trinkets. After what felt like an eternity, Clara's eyes landed on a beautiful white satin evening gown. It was delicate, with intricate lacework and a shimmering, elegant sheen, and it was her size, too. Clara hesitated for a moment, her fingers brushing against the smooth fabric. The price tag was modest, and the shopkeeper offered an even lower rate when he saw her interest. "I'll take it," she said, her voice filled with a mix of relief and excitement. She could hardly believe her luck. The shopkeeper wrapped the gown in papers, and Clara took it home, her spirits lifted. When the night of the dance arrived, Clara was a vision of grace and beauty. The gown hugged her figure perfectly. Thomas, upon seeing her, was awestruck. They made their way to the hotel, and as they entered, the ballroom was abuzz with admiration. Clara felt like she was walking on air, her worries forgotten. The evening was everything she had dreamed of. She danced with Thomas and many others, her laughter mingling with the music. But as the night wore on, Clara began to feel faint and dizzy. She put it down to the excitement and exertion of dancing. "I think I've danced too much," she told Thomas, her voice barely above a whisper. Concern etched onto his face. He helped her out of the ballroom and into the cool night air. They arrived at Clara's small home, where she went straight to her room. Thomas, though reluctant to leave her, returned to the dance. He promised to check in on her later. Clara lay down in her bed, hoping that a good rest would help her feel better. Morning came, but Clara did not wake. Her mother, frantic with worry, found her daughter's lifeless body in the early hours of the day, cold and unresponsive. Her mother's screams pierced the quiet house, drawing neighbors and Thomas, who had returned to check on Clara. The doctor was called, and he conducted a preliminary examination. He was baffled by the cause of Clara's death and suggested an autopsy to uncover the mystery. The coroner, a meticulous man with a reputation for thoroughness, undertook the task with solemn care. The results were chilling. Clara had been poisoned, but not by any conventional means. The autopsy revealed traces of embalming fluid in her bloodstream, the substance used to preserve bodies, and it was determined that the fabric had contained a lethal amount of the toxic fluid, which soaked into Clara's pores as she danced. The shopkeeper was questioned, and after some prodding, he admitted that the gown had come from an undertaker's helper. The helper had sold it to him under the guise of a donation, but it had not been a donation at all. The dress had been worn by a young woman who passed away tragically. The helper stole it just before the woman was buried, hoping to make a quick profit. Thomas was devastated by the news, and Clara's mother was left to mourn her daughter. The pawn shop was closed, and the shopkeeper and undertaker's helper were both arrested, though the damage was already done. The Grand Hotel where the dance had been became a symbol of sorrow, a place where no one would dare host a joyful event, and eventually it shuttered as well. The story became a cautionary tale whispered by mothers to their daughters, a reminder that dangers can lurk in the most unexpected places. But amidst the grief, a memorial was erected in her honor, a quiet garden where wildflowers bloomed every spring. Though Clara was gone, her memory lived on, not in the haunting silence of an empty ballroom, but in the gentle breeze that carried her name through the flowers. It was on the top shelf of an old bookcase, covered with dust and barely visible. Lisa decided she had to find out what it was. Of all the things in the old junk shop, it aroused her curiosity the most. She had looked through old books, prints, and postcards for hours. Nothing had caught her interest, but the old box, high and out of reach, intrigued her. She looked around for the old man who ran the store, but he had gone into the back room. She saw a stepladder across the room and brought it over to the bookcase. It shook on the uneven floorboards as she climbed to the top step. Lisa patted her hand along the surface of the top shelf, trying to find the box. The dirt was thick and gritty on the board. Then she felt it. The cardboard was cold and soft from being in the damp room for such a long time. She lifted the box down slowly, trying to steady her balance on the ladder. As the side of the box reached her eye level, she could read the words, 500 pieces, stepladder, and climbed down a few steps. Then she blew away some of the dust off the lid. It billowed up around her with a musty, dead odor. but now she could make out a few more words on top of the box. The strangest jigsaw puzzle in the world. There were more words underneath that, but they had been rubbed away from the cardboard lid. The big picture on the cover had been curiously damaged. Lisa could just make out some areas of light and dark. It looked as though the scene might be in a room, but most of the picture had been scratched off the cardboard box, probably with some sharp instrument. The mysterious nature of the jigsaw puzzle made it even more appealing to Lisa. She decided she would buy it. The lid was taped securely, which probably meant that all the pieces would still be there. As she carefully climbed down the stepladder holding the box in both hands, Lisa smiled to herself. It was quite a find, just the sort of thing she had always hoped to discover while rummaging through secondhand stores. The owner of the store came out of the back room as she was walking up to the sales desk. He looked curiously at the box when Lisa set it down. "And where did you find that?" he asked her. Lisa pointed to where she had set up the stepladder. "It was on top of that bookcase. You could barely see it from the floor."
"Well, I've never seen it before, that's for sure,"
the man said.
"Can't imagine how you found it."
Lisa was more pleased than ever about her find. She felt as though the puzzle had been hiding up there, waiting for her to discover it. She paid the 25 cents he asked for the puzzle and wrapped it carefully in the newspapers he gave her to take it home in. It was late on a Saturday afternoon. Lisa lived alone in a small room in an old apartment house. She had no plans for Saturday night, so now she decided to spend the whole evening working on the puzzle. She stopped and bought some meat, bread, and cheese for sandwiches. She would eat while she put the puzzle together. As soon as she had climbed the flight of stairs to her room and put away the groceries, Lisa cleaned off the big table in the center of the room and set the box down on it. The strangest jigsaw puzzle in the world. Lisa read the words again. She wondered what that could mean. How strange could a jigsaw puzzle be? The tape that held the lid down was still strong. Lisa got out a kitchen knife to slice through it. When she lifted the cover off the box, a musty smell came from inside, but the jigsaw pieces all looked in good condition. Lisa picked one up. The color was faded, but the picture was clear. She could see the shape of a finger in the piece. It looked like a woman's finger. Lisa sat down and started to lay out the pieces, top side up on the large table. As she took them from the box, she sorted out the flat-edged pieces from the inside ones. Every so often, she would recognize something in one of the pieces. She saw some blonde hair, a window pane, and a small vase. There was a lot of wood texture in the pieces, plus what looked like wallpaper. Lisa noticed that the wallpaper in the puzzle looked a lot like the wallpaper in her own room. She wondered if her wallpaper was as old as the jigsaw puzzle. It would be an incredible coincidence, but it could be the same. By the time Lisa had all the pieces laid out on the table, it was 6:30. She got up and made herself a sandwich. Already, her back was beginning to hurt a little from leaning over the table, but she couldn't stay away from the puzzle. She went back to the table and set her sandwich down beside her. It was always like that when she did jigsaws. Once she started, she couldn't stop until the puzzle was all put together. She began to sort the pieces according to color. There were dark brown pieces, whitish pieces, the wallpaper pieces, and some that seemed to be like glass, perhaps a window. As she slowly ate her sandwich, Lisa pieced together the border. When she was finished, she knew she had been right about the setting of the picture when she had first seen the puzzle. It was a room. One side of the border was wallpaper. Lisa decided to fill that in first. She was curious about its resemblance to her own wallpaper. She gathered all the pieces together that had the blue and lilac flower design. As she fit them together, it became clear that the wallpaper in the puzzle was identical to the wallpaper in her room. Lisa glanced back and forth between the puzzle and her wall. It was an exact match. By now, it was 8:30. Lisa leaned back in her chair. Her back was stiff. She looked over at her window. The night was black outside. Lisa got up and walked over to the window. Suddenly, she felt uneasy, alone in the apartment, and she pulled the white shade down. She paced around the room once, trying to think of something else she might do other than finish the puzzle, but nothing else interested her, so she went back and sat down at the table. Next, she started to fill in the lower right-hand corner. There was a rug and then a chair. This part of the puzzle was very dark. Lisa noticed uneasily that the chair was the same shape as one sitting in the corner of her room, but the colors didn't seem exactly the same. Her chair was maroon. The one in the puzzle seemed almost black. Lisa continued to fill in the border toward the middle. There was more wallpaper to finish on top. The left-hand side did turn out to be a window. Through it, a half-moon hung in a dark sky. But it was the bottom of the puzzle that began to bother Lisa. As the pieces fell into place, she saw a picture of a pair of legs crossed underneath a table. They were the legs of a young woman. Lisa reached down and ran her hand along one of her legs. Suddenly, she felt as though something was crawling up it, but it must have been her imagination. She stared down at the puzzle. It was almost 3/4 done. Only the middle remained. Lisa glanced at the lid to the puzzle box. The strangest jigsaw puzzle, she shuddered. Lisa leaned back in her chair again. Her back ached. Her neck muscle was tense and strained. She thought about quitting the puzzle completely. It scared her now. She stood up and stretched. Then she looked down at the puzzle on the table. It looked different from the higher angle. Lisa was shocked by what she saw. Her body began to tremble all over. It was unmistakable. The picture in the puzzle was her own room. The window was placed correctly in relation to the table. The bookcase stood in its exact spot against the wall. Even the carved legs of the table were the same. Lisa raised her hand to knock the pieces of the puzzle apart. She didn't want to finish it. She didn't want to find out what the hole in the middle of the puzzle might turn out to be. But then she lowered her hand. Perhaps it was worse not to know. Perhaps it was worse to wait and wonder. Lisa sank back down into the chair at the table. She fought away the fear that crept into the sore muscles of her back. Deliberately, piece by piece, she began to fill in the hole in the puzzle. She put together a picture of a table on which lay a jigsaw puzzle. This puzzle inside the puzzle was finished, but Lisa couldn't make out what it showed. She pieced together the young woman who was sitting at the table, the young woman who was herself. As she filled in the picture, her own body slowly filled with horror and dread. It was all there in the picture. The vase filled with blue cornflowers, her red cardigan sweater, the wild look of fear in her own face. The jigsaw lay before her, finished except for 2 adjoining pieces. They were dark pieces, ones she hadn't been able to fit into the area of the window. Lisa looked behind her. The white blind was drawn over the window. With relief, she realized that the puzzle picture was not exactly like her room. It showed the black night behind the window pane and a moon shining in the sky. With trembling hands, Lisa reached for the second-to-last piece. She dropped it into one of the empty spaces. It seemed to be half a face, but not a human face. She reached for the last piece. She pressed it into the small hole left in the picture. The face was complete. The face in the window. It was more horrible than anything she had ever seen or dreamed. Lisa looked at the picture of herself in the puzzle, and then back at that face. Then she whirled around. The blind was no longer down over her window. The night showed black through the window pane. A half-moon hung low in the sky. And Lisa screamed. The face was there too. Long ago, a small village was plagued by a monster. The monster had never been seen nor heard. It never left tracks or evidence. The only proof of its existence was its victims. The victims were always killed in the same manner. 10 jagged holes would be found in their necks. At first, the monster attacked only small animals. A farmer woke one morning to find that 3 of his sheep had bled to death. Then, 3 pet dogs in the village were found dead, with the same strange claw marks in their necks. Rumors circulated in the village. Everyone heard about the animals, but no one could give a logical explanation for what had killed them. Next, a young calf was found dead. It had bled to death too, its jugular vein punctured by the 10 mysterious holes. After this, men began to arm themselves. Shotguns were set beside beds at night. Animals were kept locked inside the barns. Throughout the village, a rash of hysteria broke loose. People put forth all kinds of wild speculation, and neighbors eyed each other with suspicion. Then it happened, what everyone had really feared. The monster attacked a human, Elmer Riley, the town drunk. Elmer was found dead one morning, with the 10 claw holes in his neck. He had died just like the sheep and the dogs and the calf. He had bled to death. Not many people in the town really cared that Elmer was dead, but it scared them to know that the monster had an appetite for humans as well. Anyone could be its prey. The men of the village banded together to form a vigilante group. They didn't know what they were fighting, which made things even worse. 2 brothers, Robert and John Harmon, were appointed head of the vigilante committee. They lived on the outskirts of the village, near the forest where most people thought the monster lived. The 2 brothers knew how the monster attacked. It had been their calf that was killed. After the first meeting of the vigilante committee, Robert and John Harmon went home to discuss their plans. They sat around the oak table in the kitchen with their father. Their old grandmother sat by the fireplace on a low chair, her black shawl wrapped around her. "We must begin the watch tonight," Robert said in a low voice. "The other men are afraid to act now, but I think tonight is the time to be on guard." "You're right," his brother agreed. "The thing, whatever it is, strikes every 5 days. It was 5 nights ago that Elmer Riley was killed." "You boys sound brave," their father interrupted. "But remember what you are dealing with. The thing seems to attack without warning. In the killing so far, there were no signs of struggle. How will you know what to watch for?" The father paused and looked over at his old mother sitting by the fireplace. "They should be careful, shouldn't they, Granny?" The old woman looked up at her son. She shuddered for a moment and then fell silent again. The 3 men went back to their conversation. They hadn't really expected to get an answer from her. Her mind had been foggy for years. Robert began to outline his plan for his father. "John and I will both take our guns to the outskirts of the forest tonight. We'll set ourselves up on the path between the forest and the village. If the monster comes out tonight, it'll have to pass by either one of us." "And what protection will you have?" the father asked worriedly. "Each other," Robert answered. "We'll stay within shouting distance of each other, and we'll keep our backs to the village so that we face the forest and the monster." "Someone has to do it," John said next to his father. "We don't know who the next victim will be. We can't just sit back and let the monster kill us off one by one." Their father stood up from the table and walked a lap around the room. Then he shook each of their hands. "Please come back to me alive," he said, his voice choking. The 2 sons picked up their rifles from the floor. Robert pulled a long, sharp machete from off the wall. As they left the room, both of them walked over to their old grandmother and kissed her goodbye. Outside, the night was nearly pitch black. A thin sliver of a moon hung low in the western sky. They walked east, toward the forest. As they drew near to where they had planned to station themselves, John whispered,
I wonder what it looks like. I've been thinking, Robert said, that it could be a bird. A giant bird that swoops down on you and digs its claws into your neck. They both looked up into the night sky. Clouds were shrouding the thin moon. It would be hard to see a dark shadow descending through the sky. I thought it might tunnel under the ground like a huge weasel, John said softly. Then it comes out and attacks you from behind. Both brothers felt the skin crawl on the backs of their necks. Slowly, they turned around and looked behind them. For several minutes, they stood there like that in the dark, paralyzed by their own horrible thoughts. We must take our places, Robert said finally. But remember, stay within shouting distance. The two brothers moved off in opposite directions. They had agreed to take 20 long paces and then stop. Standing in the dark, Robert carefully cocked his gun. Then he took the machete and stuck it in the soft ground by his feet, and waited. 40 paces away, John fumbled nervously with his gun. He felt his hands shaking. Could he use the gun if he had to? He wished he could see Robert, but his brother was obscured by the dark shadows of bushes and trees. John turned around to look toward the village. He wished he were safe inside the house. Then he heard the crackling of a twig in back of him. He spun around to face the forest but saw nothing and heard no more. John relaxed. He set the butt of his gun down on the ground and leaned against it, and he started to feel drowsy. And then he felt the 10 claws digging into his neck. A terrified scream echoed through the forest to Robert. He grabbed his gun and machete and followed the awful screams to his brother. He drew near but couldn't see anything in the dark night. But then he heard John's voice, choking and desperate. Quick! Swing the machete behind where you hear my voice! Hurry! Robert threw down his gun, grasping the machete in both hands. He swung it above his head and let it fall. It made a hacking sound before it hit the ground. John had been groaning the whole time, but now he stopped. For an instant, Robert thought he had killed his brother. But then John started to babble incoherently. Robert thought he heard something moving back away from them. It sounded like a giant rat scuttling over the dead leaves. But he could not see it. He fell down on the ground by his brother's body. Moaning again, John took his brother's hand and put it up to his own neck. Robert shrunk back at what he felt. It was a hand, a withered hand with sharp, pointed claws. He had hacked it off the monster with his machete, and it was still stuck inside of John's neck. Robert jerked the foul claws from his brother's neck and bound the 10 bloody holes with his handkerchief. He carried his brother back to the village, leaving the withered hand lying on the forest floor. Their father met them at the door, weeping with fear. He had heard John's terrified screams in the forest. Now he wept with happiness to see that both his sons were alive yet. They laid John out on the couch and washed out the claw marks in his neck. They could see that a few seconds more and the claws would have killed him. As he bandaged his brother's neck, Robert thought about the monster. He hoped it was in the forest now, dying a slow death. All this time, no one had noticed that the old woman was gone from her spot by the fireplace. And no one noticed when she came in through the back door and sat down there again. From her low seat, she looked over to Robert and John. No one heard the hiss that came from her wrinkled mouth, and no one saw the bloody stump that she hid underneath her black shawl.
The boy lay quietly in the dark. He was listening. Next door, the boarder was making the sounds of preparing for bed. The boy could hear him brush his teeth, gargle, and then splash water onto his face. The sounds made the boy grit his teeth. He hated the boarder. The two of them shared the upstairs floor of a small house in the poor area of town. The boy's parents had taken the boarder in to add his rent to their meager income. Until then, the boy had always had the upstairs to himself. The extra bedroom had been his playroom. Now the boy was kept to his own small space. In the next room, the boarder was getting his bed ready for the night. The boy heard him plump the pillows. Then he heard the creak of the old bed springs as the boarder lay down. The boy wondered if the boarder knew how well he could be heard, how much the boy knew about every move he made. The sound of the light switch being flicked off came through the thin walls. Now the boy knew the boarder was lying in the dark too, listening for him. It was a waiting game. The boy knew the boarder would be going out tonight. For the last month, he had known about the Friday night journeys. This night, the boy planned to follow the boarder to wherever it was that he went. The boy lay perfectly still in his bed. He had learned how to be very quiet. It bothered him to think that the boarder could hear him as well as he could hear the boarder. So he had begun to walk softly and creep slowly into bed, and to do everything quietly, like a cat. The boarder didn't know how much the boy could hear from his room. But no sound came from the boarder's room now, except the muffled sounds of snoring. The boy hated that snoring, just as he hated everything about the boarder. He hated his snickering laugh and the way the boarder looked at his mother at the breakfast table. He despised his chores of shining the boarder's shoes and going on errands for him. Most of all, he hated the boarder's money, which his parents needed so badly. The money was the reason the boy lay awake in bed. No one knew how the boarder got his money. No one knew how he spent his days away from the house. No one asked questions because the rent money was always there, fully paid, in advance. The boy lay in the dark and struggled to keep his eyes open. Tonight, he was going to follow the boarder and find out his secret. The seconds of time ticked by in the boy's mind as he lay waiting. He knew the boarder would pretend to sleep like this at first, but the time was drawing near now for him to make his move. The boy waited in silent darkness. Then, from the next room, came the slow creaking of springs. The boy raised his head to hear better. The springs creaked again as the boarder's weight crushed against them. Then, they were quiet. Now the boy knew that the boarder was preparing for his journey. He would be slipping into his clothes in the dark, pulling on his rubber-soled shoes. The boy slipped out of bed and reached for his own clothes. He didn't make a sound as he dressed himself and put on his sneakers. He tiptoed over to the window in his room and pressed himself against the wall. He was ready. The window in the boarder's room slid open with a slight scratching noise of wood against wood. The boy stared sideways out his window. He watched as two legs quietly and carefully made their way across the small balcony outside the window. Then they disappeared. For a few seconds the boy heard no sound. Then there was a dull thud on the ceiling above him. The boarder had gotten up onto the roof. Moving quietly, just like the boarder, the boy slid open his window. He swung his body over the sill and onto the small balcony. He knew he was taking a chance of the boarder seeing him, but he knew if he waited too long, the boarder might be out of sight. The boy climbed down the drainage pipe up to the roof as the boarder had done before him. He slowly raised his eyes to the level of the roof. Standing 20 feet away and staring across the rooftops was the boarder. The boy could see the eager expression on his face. He could also see the shiny hook hanging from his belt, and the coil of thick rope hung over his shoulder. The boy lowered his head as the boarder moved across the rooftop, jumping from their house to the next one. The roofs were only 4 feet apart because the houses were built so close together in this neighborhood. The boy saw the boarder walk across that roof and jump on to the next house. It was a dark night, and the moon was hidden by clouds. The boy hoisted himself onto the roof and crept over to the chimney. 3 houses away, he could see the boarder walking steadily east. He knew he had to follow the boarder fast enough to keep up with him, but slowly enough not to be seen. The boy came to the space between his house and the next one. The cement walkway between the two houses stared up at him from 40 feet below. He felt sick for a moment. Then he leapt across to the next roof. As he landed, he saw the boarder turn around from 3 houses away. The boy flattened himself against the tar roof. He watched as the boarder paused, searching the darkness for the source of the sound he had heard. But the boarder couldn't see the boy's body pressed up against the roof, and he went on, jumping to the next roof to the east. The boy managed the next jump more quietly, and the boarder didn't turn around. It became like a game of leapfrog between them. The boarder jumping, then the boy jumping 3 houses behind him. The boy learned not to look down at the black, gaping spaces between the roofs. His face, too, took on an expression of eager excitement. Ahead, the boy could see that they were coming to the end of the block of small houses. As the boarder came to the last house, he turned left and began to cross the roofs going north. The boy knew that these roofs were no longer set apart. They were the roofs of the stores on Main Street, which were built right beside one another. The boy ran softly to a chimney and, crouching behind it, resting. The boarder, too, had stopped. He seemed to be counting the roofs of the connected buildings with his outstretched hand. Then he moved on down the roofs, walking confidently now. The boy followed slowly, bent down low. The roofs were flatter here than they had been on the houses. He followed behind the line of chimneys that stretched out in a row across the roofs. Suddenly, deliberately, the boarder stopped in front of one of the chimneys. The boy jerked his body to a halt and darted behind the closest chimney. When he peeked around it, he saw the boarder shrugging the heavy coil of rope off his shoulder. He picked up the end of the rope and began to wind the coil around the chimney. The boy watched as he worked to make a strong knot in the rope. Then, the boarder picked up the rest of the coil of rope and dropped it down the chimney. After a few seconds, a dull thud came from inside of the bricks. The boy sat behind the chimney, watching intently. His mind was in a fever. Now he knew the boarder's secret. The metal hook from the boarder's belt flashed in the dull moonlight. The boy watched the boarder fasten the hook onto the chimney ledge. Then, as the moon shone brightly from an opening in the cloudy sky, the boy could see the boarder slowly descending into the chimney. As the boarder's head disappeared, the boy moved quickly across the roofs. He came to the chimney tied round with the boarder's rope, and sat down and listened. The boarder's grunts came up the chimney as he lowered himself down the rope. The boy knew what the boarder planned to do. He was looking for an old open fireplace. He could enter a store, rob it, and return up the chimney by rope. There would be no chance of a fire burning on such a hot summer night. The boarder's grunts disgusted the boy. Now that he knew the boarder's secret, he hated him even more. He eyed the rope twisted around the chimney. The knot was directly in front of him. The boy touched the knot. It wasn't a very good one. He began to undo the loose end, thinking how stupid the boarder was. He began to pick at the knot more, thinking of how the boarder looked at his mother. He began to tug the loose end of the rope through the final tie, thinking of how the boarder's room used to be his own. The knot came undone and the rope started to slip around the chimney. Then, suddenly, it disappeared down through the top. Seconds later, the boy heard a startled cry, followed by a dull thud. The boy crouched near the roof. He knew the boarder had fallen. It sounded as though he had landed on the sealed bottom of the chimney. The boy wondered if the boarder was dead. But then he heard the boarder's voice, grunting with effort. He listened to the voice for a long time as the boarder desperately tried to climb back up the chimney. He listened until the boarder's voice took on the mad sounds of panic, and then he ran away. He ran across the store roofs, across the house roofs, jumping from one to the other. He reached the roof of his own house and swung himself down the pipe onto the small balcony. Quietly, he slipped through the window and shut it. In the still darkness, he dropped his clothes on the floor and stole into bed. It was 6 years later. 3 more boarders had come and gone. The boy was 18 now, and he rented the extra upstairs room himself. His parents never asked him where he got the money, and he joked that he did night work. One morning he went down to breakfast as usual. His mother had his food and newspaper waiting for him on the table. She gave him all the attention now that she used to give the boarders. As he sipped his coffee, he picked up the morning paper. He leafed through it, reading the headlines. Then, a small article caught his eye. The boy read it slowly, and the whole time, his fingers worked unconsciously, going through the motions of untying a knot. Body found in chimney. Yesterday, workers discovered the remains of a body in an old sealed-off chimney. A coroner on the scene said that the person had been dead for at least 5 years. Authorities suspect that a cat burglar, trying to rob a jewelry store in the building, had become stuck in the chimney. Because of the advanced deterioration of the body, no identification could be made. The only possessions found with the body were a steel hook and an old rope.